Hi, this is Scott Bradfield. This is novel writing for City Lit. I had to get myself adjusted here. I'm still using this pretty much a makeshift camera setup with the iPad. And this week I wanted to carry on with our discussion of the Brian Moore novel. Not because it's the greatest novel ever written. It's certainly not the best novel Moore ever wrote. It's a very good, solid Brian Moore novel. But because one of the things I like about Moore is almost all the basic techniques are in evidence, as I've said in this book. You can see all the basic techniques. You will see these techniques in other good writers, but it's hard to think of an important narrative technique you will not see clearly exemplified in Brian Moore's books. And what I want to talk about today is maybe a bit personal at the beginning. And many of you may have noticed in my comments in the classes, and if you've taken my classes in non-virtual courses, that I make a pretty big case against ever using a flashback. I hate flashbacks in my students' writings almost all the time. Now this is not because the flashback isn't useful, or again, I think the flashback is almost always useless, but memories of events in the past, recollections of past events, cutting judiciously to former scenes or past scenes or recollected scenes can be very effective, and many people will do them very well. But my experience has been, and this is a very personal feeling here, is that my students are very, very, very concerned about doing flashbacks. I probably have spent more time in my classes trying to explain to students why I think they shouldn't use flashbacks than I have done in doing anything else in a class. And my theory is this, that it portrays a certain anxiety. You'll see this in published novels. And the anxiety is that when you write a novel, the most important thing your readers are interested in, and your characters are interested in, is what happens next to them. This is what, you go back to the beginnings of poetic theory and Aristotle, and he talks about the importance of plot. You can read many books about plot and narrative arcs and how many subplots you should have, blah, blah, blah. The most important thing about a plot is that it moves forward. It moves from A to B to C, from Monday to Tuesday to Wednesday to Thursday. It doesn't move from Monday to the previous Thursday to 10 years before that to today to tomorrow to 3 weeks ago. It doesn't pop around in any useful way. The novel moves forward, and the story moves forward, and a plot moves forward. There are individual scenes, and the scenes should have some integrity. And Aristotle says all of these things, the very beginnings of poetic theory. That's why it's kind of fascinating to read it. And it's kind of it's not a difficult or complicated philosophical argument. It's what we know as readers. We want the scenes to have an integrity and something happens in them, and the scene should lead to the next scene, not what happened the day before. Now, one of the things that many people and many of my students get concerned about is telling the backstory. They're often telling me, well, I have to flash back, I need to tell the backstory, say what happened in the previous season, how this person got the way they are. I want people to understand why they're angry, or why they're happy, or why their marriage is not working, or why it is working. And I can't tell you how many times I've tried to explain in classes and directly to students, is that your readers don't care about most of that. They want to know what's going to happen to your character next. And that's what you need, whether you're writing, The Grapes of Wrath, in which you're wondering if the Jodes are going to find some money and are going to pay their bills, or if you're reading a P.G. Wodehouse novel, or you're reading an Agatha Christie novel. It's what happens next that you need to, that's the prize you got to keep your eye on. What's going to happen next? Now, one of the things I want to just show is a couple of examples, and I'd like you to look for this again in other writers. So Moore is just an example, textbook example. But look in whatever books you're reading, science fiction novels, thrillers, romance novels, it doesn't matter. How do writers move forward in time, move past the boring bits to the next significant scene. Don't worry about how you're going to get that backstory in. One of the things I tell my students all the time is if you're worried about the backstory, if you're thinking about how do I do the flashback, you're not thinking like a writer. You can put that stuff, you'll put that stuff in somehow. It's not hard to get that information in. What's hard is just to focus on what happens next. And it's not that hard to do, but it is an anxiety, I feel, that some writers start to feel, and rather than move forward, they start writing all this backstory. It's sort of a similar neurosis, I'd have to say, to writing lots of notes for a novel. Some people will write lots of notes, and they'll never write a novel. So let me show you a couple of quick examples here. There's so many nice bits in this book, but one of the things that this, more so than any novel by more I can think of, is you hear almost nothing about Bem's history, or his past, or how he became a man of prominence. You just hear what he's doing now. And when you get bits of information from the past, it's in the context of what's happening to him now. Look briefly at page 62. This is one of the few telling moments about his past in the whole book. This is chapter 8. It should be the same page. Down on page 62. He's just escaped from these fake secret police. And a cop picks him up. The police pick him up. And as they stop him, he looks in his wallet. He says, in his jacket pocket, he kept, always, a small worn wallet containing a photograph of his dead mother, a doctor's certificate listing his blood type and medical history, and the plastic-covered identity card issued to all citizens. If they are already searching for me, it is useless to resist. But if this is a normal police check, my card tells nothing but my Christian name and surname, birthplace, and age. That's a very simple piece of writing. It's not flamboyant prose, but the technique is we see him pull something out. We see the objective data of his life. The picture of his dead mother is quite a significant thing for an older man to be carrying around in his wallet. We don't go into what many weak writers would do, into a long discussion of his mother and how she died and how he felt for her and all the memories he might have of her. It's kept very concretely in this now moment. His concerns about what the police are going to learn about him in the wallet. So it's a nice little moment, and as a reader you may not sit down and dwell on it, but it does tell you something about this man. I'm going to show you one more example. And I think this is a really good example of what we're talking about. What Bem was like when he was younger. We don't have any flashbacks to him as a young man. We have him sometimes walking through streets he remembers, and sometimes brief memories of how he lived when he was young may come through. But for the most part, we just have him in this moment of escaping from people and trying to solve these mysteries. If you look at page 110, I'll leave this scene here for you. He goes to meet his friend Jan Lay. And Jan is hooked up to a kidney dialysis machine. It's a very moving scene. And he doesn't dwell on it. But when we come in there, it's on page 110. And Bem has got the surgical mask on. Jan Lay was in a hospital bed, his arm connected to a dialysis machine. He had removed his shoes and jacket, and a large vein in his arm pulsed black and blue against his white, waxy skin as the machine silently did its work. "Sit down, won't you?" Jan said. "I think you can take your mask off, doctor. I'm not contagious." He pulled off the mask and suddenly, close to tears, bent down and kissed his old friend's brow. Jan's gray hair lay thin as a tracery on his skull. His eyes were dulled as if by drugs. It's a very strong moment. This is an old friend, and we see this kind of loss of animation in the face, and we see it from the eyes of a friend. "How are you, Jan?" he said. "I'm sorry to get you mixed up in this." "I've always been mixed up in your affairs," Jan said with a smile. "Haven't I, Tonio?" "Not like this." Now, there's a few moments like this between Bem and old friends, particularly Jan. And we don't really hear how they were mixed up together. We get the impression that Bem has been a bit of a troublemaker in the past, has often been getting his friends into some scrapes. And we don't have it explained to us. We don't have flashbacks. Because the most important part is not what happened 20 years ago. It's what happens now between these old friends. And seeing your friend weak and seeing him dulled by this condition. And that's what Moore goes for. And that's what you have to go for when you write. Not what happened before the book started, but where your characters are at every moment as the novel progresses. And I'll really impress that upon you. So you keep reading any good books. Look for examples of this. How we avoid backstory, how we don't need it, how we move the book forward, and how we make the scene we're in effective. Not what happened 20 years before the scene happened, or 2 days before the scene happened. What happens now. Okay? See you next week. Bye.